Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly Tuesday live stream. This is a live discussion that we do every week related to digital transformations. This is part of the weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast that we publish each Wednesday. So by being part of this live stream here today, you're part of our live production of our podcast. So thanks for being here. That podcast is called Transformation Ground Control, by the way. If you go to transformationgroundcontrol.com, you can find past episodes of that show and keep up with future episodes as well. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformations throughout the world. And I'm excited for our topic here today, which is the collision of ethics and artificial intelligence, a super interesting topic that we have never covered on this podcast. So I'm excited for that topic, which is new to us, as well as a first-time guest on the show, who I'll introduce here in just a moment. Before I introduce our guest, though, a couple quick logistical items. First of all, I mentioned this is part of our weekly podcast every Wednesday, transformationgroundcontrol.com. We're going to actually take this content and we'll edit it, add some additional content to it, and make it part of a formal podcast that comes out in roughly 2 to 3 weeks from now at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And then secondly, and perhaps more importantly, this podcast or this conversation is meant to be conversational. So we're trying to get audience questions as much as we can. So any sort of comments or questions you have, we'd love to hear from you. We're watching all the streams right now. So just whatever platform you're watching on, just drop in the chat whatever questions or comments you have. We're watching the streams for YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter X, whatever you want to call it, for the entire conversation here today. So be sure to drop that in the chat, any questions or comments you have as it relates to artificial intelligence, ethics, bias, all this stuff we're going to get to here today. And then lastly, before I introduce our guest, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat, what city and country are you joining from today? I'd love to hear where you're joining from today. We tend to draw a global audience. It's always fun to see where in the world you're joining. So city and country, I'd love to hear from you. I'm from Denver, Colorado here today. I'd love to hear where you're all from as well. So having said all that, the topic today, the collision of ethics and AI, and joining me today is Paige Lord, who's a senior product manager at GitHub. So Paige, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yes, we actually tried it. We tried this conversation a couple weeks ago, but I fell ill, and so we're trying it again here. So thanks for rescheduling here to do this conversation here today.
Of course.
And before we jump into all this stuff related to ethics and AI, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, Paige. How'd you get into this space? What do you do now? Love to hear about that.
Yeah, I have been in the world of technology for 12 years. This is where I've spent my entire career, and all of it has been in the Microsoft ecosystem. So 9 years at Microsoft, and then I've been at GitHub for almost 3 years now, which is owned by Microsoft. So I always feel like that's important to call out. Not everybody knows that. In terms of how long I've been in the world of artificial intelligence, I started in the data and AI group at Microsoft just a couple years into my time at Microsoft, and I've stayed in the data and AI work stream since. And then in 2016 was when I became particularly interested in the world of responsible AI and how we can build these systems that are meant to mimic humans, how we build them in a way that promotes human flourishing and doesn't cause harm. So I went back to school. I got my master's degree from Harvard with a focus in artificial intelligence and privacy law. And I wrote my master's thesis on the use of facial recognition technology and by U.S. law enforcement and violations of civil liberties, and graduated in 2022 with that degree. I now work at GitHub, as you said, as a product marketing manager for our AI and responsible AI products, and take those products and features to market. But I also have my own, business on the side where I teach people about responsible AI, and specifically on social media, TikTok to be exact, where I teach people about, digital literacy, AI literacy, responsible artificial intelligence considerations related to policy. And so that's a little bit about me.
Cool. Very cool. So how did you, well, first of all, I have to mention, I do not have a master's degree from Harvard. So right now I have to just come clean and say I'm outgunned here.
That's okay.
But aside from that, how did you get involved with AI and ethics? Like, how did you bring this all together? That sort of diverse background you started with. How did it all come together, and what drew you to the space?
Yeah. So what drew me to artificial intelligence, I think, is part of it is my own personal story. So I grew up in a really low income home in rural Oregon, and I grew up well below the poverty line, and grew up, below you might say, below the digital divide. So without access to the information communication technologies that other individuals have. And so I think I had just seen at a very young age a lot of ways that there is inequality, and that opportunity, finds its way to certain groups and maybe not to others. And so I think that I've always had sort of this in me, this desire to see there be more equality. And then as I got into the tech space, that became more, clear to me that there are some individuals who, through either where they're born or their proximity to certain groups of individuals, they have more opportunity that they can take advantage of. And I considered that as I looked at technology as I got into Microsoft. I was close to, as they were building the responsible AI principles out and the board. I was there when that was occurring and had a kind of a front row seat to that when it first started, and championed those principles in Microsoft in our consulting services group for a number of years. So I have always just been drawn to this space of understanding how technology can benefit humanity, but also really not being afraid to recognize where it can cause some level of harm and confront that head on so that we can make decisions that positively impact people. That's really what drew me.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. It seems like such a cutting edge field too. I mean, it doesn't seem like an area that's really well defined or well established yet. And so it seems like an exciting space to be in right now for you're probably seeing the good and the bad, I imagine, of some of the ethical considerations of AI.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting space to be in. I like to tell people that I was here before it was cool. So
Right.
I was in it before it was like the thing to talk about. And I still think that responsible AI in general, much like artificial intelligence, is really misunderstood right now, or just people don't have a good understanding of the possible benefit that responsible AI can bring to their businesses, or even having your own personal set of values. As somebody who is online teaching about responsible AI, I have to have my own set of values and principles that guide how I have conversations about these things, so that I'm not leaning into things like sensationalism in order to get views, or I'm not telling a story that sounds more intense than it actually is. And so I think having those guiding principles is like just maybe a newer concept, just like the field of responsible AI and much of the AI that we're seeing.
Yeah, very interesting. So as we get into sort of what ethical AI means, or what some of the ethical considerations or concerns might be as it relates to AI, one thing that inevitably comes up is bias. And so what are some of the ways that companies can mitigate bias in AI, and how can we ensure that these measures are effective over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's one that's still being explored by a number of researchers around the world, and certainly practically at these tech companies. Governments are asking these questions as well. But one of the things that I always say is making sure that we have a diverse group of individuals in the room. And where the ideating is happening, if you have an idea, you're talking about an AI idea and you want to innovate, you should have a wide variety of perspectives in the room. People who come from different sides of the political spectrum, people who come from different parts of the world, people who have different, abilities, things like that. So just bring a wide variety of people into the room. That's one way to kind of begin the process of working toward AI systems that don't have bias. Although it is important to say off the top, and I think that most people would agree with this, that there is always going to be some element of bias in most AI systems. It depends on the type of system and the size of system and what it's meant to do. But working toward reducing that risk, having diversity in the room. Representative data is really important as well. There are a lot of companies who ask for AI systems to be built, and they'll say, we've got 100 years worth of data. This is what happened with the Wells Fargo situation, where they had a number of years of data that they used to train their model, which was designed to decide who could qualify for a loan and who couldn't. Well, the model was biased at the end of the day, because it was denying Black applicants at a higher rate than it was denying white applicants, even though the qualifications on paper were pretty similar. So making sure that the data that you have is representative, and that you're not just using historical data because you happen to have it. And then building in explainable AI techniques so you don't end up with artificial intelligence that comes out on the other side with an output, but you can't actually understand how it got there. So making sure that your AI is explainable. And while you ask your next question, I have to plug in my computer. I forgot to do that. So this is embarrassing, but hopefully
No.
relatable. So I'm going to grab my charger real quick while you
Yeah.
ask your next question.
Yeah, no problem. And hopefully you can still hear. No, that's a great point about the bias side of it. And what you mentioned data, and it sort of leads to another question, which is as AI becomes more prevalent in decision making, what role do transparency and accountability play, and how can organizations balance that with that need with innovation? So
I
what do
think,
you
yeah, transparency and accountability should be some of the top priorities, which is hard to say. I think especially for people who are in businesses right now who are businesses are just trying to ask the question, how do we get the AI in the door and start reaping the benefits of the AI? But
right?
there should be a parallel question of the same level of priority and importance, which says, how do we be transparent about our use of artificial intelligence? And then how do we build systems so that we know where we are accountable for whatever the output is? So I think that it is of tremendous importance. But when you have the type of situation we have right now, which is where everybody's grabbing for market share and people want to really see profits and benefit to their company, which is not necessarily a bad thing, it becomes harder and harder for people to prioritize things like transparency and accountability in their own company. And then they think, well, I can do it down the road. AI is just beginning. So a year from now, 2 years, 3 years from now, we can have a conversation about responsible AI. But by then, you're talking about upending systems that are already in place in your organization. And then it's a much bigger change for your organization to try and lean into the idea of accountability and transparency with processes that match it and governance in place. It's a much bigger deal to upend and do that a couple years down the road than it is to start with that right now.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And do you see, when you think in general about organizations and usage of AI, their usage of AI, and how they want to make sure there's not bias and they want to protect themselves and that sort of thing. Do you see companies that struggle with that need to put those guardrails in place with balancing that with innovation? Is there a conflict there, or can you do both together, or have you seen it coexist?
I think you can do both together, but I think it depends on, I truly believe that I'm a big fan of change management. And I do believe one of the core tenets of change management is that you're probably not going to get anything changed in a way that it has sticking power unless you have sponsorship from the top. So if you have leadership and all they care about is driving profit and implementing AI so that they can say that you have AI in your organization, then it's probably going to be really hard to implement anything related to responsible AI. The organization will rally around the idea of innovation and the idea of, whether they're building or whether they're implementing AI systems, they'll rally around that idea of innovation and they won't rally around the idea of responsible AI. But I do think that it can be done at the same time. I think that I think two things can be true at once. You can be innovative, you can be building really cool things, but you can also be considering how to do that responsibly. And I have a personal belief that the organizations that are thinking about both of those things right now and who are prioritizing both of those things in equal measure right now will actually be significantly ahead of those organizations who are not prioritizing responsible AI in tandem with their innovation goals. 5 years down the road, I think we're going to start seeing that chasm.
Yeah, super interesting. Here's a semi-related question here from Laik on LinkedIn. I'll try to fit the whole question here, although it's not going to fit, but I'll read it to you anyway. This is from Laik on LinkedIn. He says, I have a question from a different ethical perspective regarding cloud vendors using client data to train models. If this is something clients are unknowingly signing up for, do you think it's time for businesses to consider training or fine-tuning their own models? And I assume he means rather than the cloud vendor models, why not train their own models? It might not be ideal for cloud vendors, but from an ethical, privacy, and even business secret standpoint, is this the right path for many companies to protect themselves? And I love this question because this is kind of a question I always have about AI in general, is like, who owns the data, and ethically, should they own that data if it's a cloud vendor taking your data, training their own language models or their own models.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on that, and how would you respond to that?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and I'm so glad that you asked this, because I think that when people talk about artificial intelligence, they're talking about a lot of times the output. A lot of times people right now, what we can get our hands on is the output, so we talk about that. But the data is so important. If it was me, I would not be choosing a cloud vendor that is using my company's information to train their model. So I would start there by having a look at the contract and getting an understanding of what is true. It's any cloud vendor you choose should be able to tell you, their legal team should be able to tell you very directly whether or not they're going to use your data. That is information that you should have available to you. If you're in a situation where you are already working with a cloud vendor and they are using your data to train their models, I do think that fine tuning can be a route that you can go. Now, you would have to see if it's the right option for your organization, because fine tuning can be a lot more expensive than just using sort of the model that the cloud vendor provides. So it definitely can be a route that you can go. It sort of depends on what type of information your company is producing and what might be used to train that model. But I would start at the beginning by asking that question: is this cloud provider using my information? And if they aren't using your information and they're unrelenting in that area, then it may be time to consider moving.
Yeah. Is there value though? Like, looking at the flip side of that, or playing devil's advocate to what you just said, if I'm a cloud vendor and I've got, say, thousands of customers that are using my software, am I having to trade off the value of having that mass amount of data that one single organization is not going to have access to and not going to be able to teach their own AI models to learn from? Am I giving up a significant amount of value by not ceding control to the cloud vendors?
As an individual sorry, I misunderstood the question. As an individual who is working for a company that is contracting with a cloud vendor?
No, like if I'm a single organization and,
Yeah.
and I want to take all my data and do something with it. Either I'm going to train my own AI model, or I'm going to let the cloud vendor take my data and train their cloud or their AI model. Am I giving up a significant amount of value because now I'm not getting the value of all that cloud vendor's other customer data that's also teaching the AI model? Like, in other words, is the AI model for a cloud vendor going to be more valuable because they have access to more data versus my own instance of AI?
Yeah, it could be. It really depends on the type of work that your organization is doing. And you may say, you know what, if I'm in this and I'm handing over my data and there's 1,000 other orgs, that are handing over their data and it's all getting scrambled together, then I'm not really going to be worried about that. And so if you know the specifics of that, and that's okay with you and your organization, and also if you trust your cloud vendor, I should have started with that too. Yeah. If you have a cloud vendor that you trust and they say, we're using this to train this model, but we're not doing anything else with your data, then I guess that is a different situation. For me personally, I tend to be a little more conservative, I would say, on the topic of data, because I think that there is a lot happening right now. If you take a look at some of the lawsuits that are coming out against Perplexity right now, 3 lawsuits against them from major players who are saying, hey, you're taking our information without asking us. And that's happening a lot in the world of artificial intelligence. So I tend to be on the side of organizations should be transparent, and certainly cloud vendors should be transparent.
Yeah, especially while so much of this is still uncertain in the court systems, and the legality of it all is still, I imagine, going to take decades to really sort this out.
I think so.
Here's another question that's interesting. This is off of YouTube. This is from Dan on YouTube. It says, with so much misinformation on social media like X and TikTok, isn't AI trained on this data by definition unethical, or at least non-transparent, or perhaps biased? I'll add that.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. So if artificial intelligence is being trained on this sort of public information out there in the world, could it, in theory, be, learning about misinformation and then perhaps not corrected? And I think that that's definitely a risk, especially because there are so many misinformation campaigns, which ironically are made faster and in some cases more effective because of artificial intelligence. And so, AI is being used to produce these campaigns and put the content out there very quickly. And so I do think that there is a challenge there. And this is why I always say, when it comes to artificial intelligence, you have got to ask questions about what you are interacting with. It's a rare situation that I will engage with AI, ChatGPT, for example, and not double check with my own sources the information that it shares with me, unless it's something that's like a recipe that's coming forward. So, and even then, I want to make sure that I'm making whatever I'm making correctly, and not just the way that ChatGPT told me to. So I do think that there is a challenge there. And to your point about, is it unethical? I think that is a really good question. I would have to think a little more about that before I made that claim that yes, this is unethical, but I will say that it is certainly risky.
What about bias, though? Maybe set aside the ethics or the ethical side of it, but just, I have a human bias. I have my opinions. I have thoughts that not everyone's going to agree with. And if that information or that opinion is shaping and teaching AI, how do you prevent that sort of bias? It kind of comes back to the first question I was asking around bias.
Yeah, I think this is why it's important for providers of the artificial intelligence to have these, what we talked about, these responsible AI systems in place, so that they can constantly be testing and checking the model. That is something that has to happen on a regular basis. It shouldn't be like a one time a year or twice a year we recalibrate this model. It's something that has to be checked on a regular basis. So in terms of the bias, I do think that there is a level of risk there. And my hope would be that their responsible AI teams have a way to monitor whatever is being taken in as data for that model, that they could take a look at, is there a huge uptick in this specific conspiracy theory or this specific bit of misinformation that we're ingesting to inform this model and train this model. And I will say also that, these organizations have a lot of control over what data informs and trains their model. My hope would be that they aren't just saying, this is everything we've got, throw it in there to train it. My hope is that they would, be aware of these situations that might be a little more challenging or dubious. So.
Yeah. Now, in the U.S., for those of us that live in the U.S., we have a presidential election coming up, and it's a heated political time right now. And AI is always a source of potential controversy, or at least a point of potential discussion when it comes to elections, because back to your point about, and Dan's point too on YouTube, about campaigns of misinformation and biases. And, that's unfortunately what a lot of political cycles are like. It's a lot of bias. It's a lot of misinformation, conflicting information, whatever you want to call it. How are you seeing AI affect, or are you seeing AI affect things like politics and, in the U.S. and elsewhere, not just in the U.S., of course?
Yeah, I think AI is definitely having an impact, but how it's having an impact and how much of an impact it's having sort of remains to be seen. We are seeing, I think it was OpenAI and Microsoft came out not long ago saying that, and this is all public information, but they came out saying that they had uncovered some misinformation plots that were using ChatGPT, and the goal was to just be disruptive in the election. It wasn't for or against one specific party. It was just to disrupt the process of democracy in the United States. And so a lot of times these misinformation campaigns are meant to just do that, just to cause enough people to question things like what might be true, that it causes disruption. I think that some of the ways that we're seeing the use of artificial intelligence, in the election, we're seeing people create videos and create images of things that perhaps didn't happen. We saw this with a tweet, or I don't know if we're calling them tweets or X's, that went wide. That was it had to do with Taylor Swift endorsing Donald Trump, and so that was something that went wide. That was something that didn't happen, and it went broadly on social media. So we're seeing those kinds of situations. We're also seeing the use of like AI audio, for example, was used to do a voiceover of a video that it was like a spoof of or a parody of Kamala Harris's campaign video using a lot of real footage from her campaign videos, and then with a voiceover of her saying a lot of things that she didn't say and would probably never say. And so, people are using AI in an effort to very quickly put out content that, tells the story that they want to tell. And I think it's ruffling a lot of feathers. I think it's definitely having an impact because it's causing people the biggest impact, I think, and I don't have the data to back this up, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think it's causing enough people to ask questions about what is real and true. So people are just like frustrated enough or confused enough that they just don't know who they would vote for. And then in some cases, you may see people who say, I'm so upset and overwhelmed by all of this that I'm not even going to vote at all.
Yeah, which is kind of the worst case outcome or worst case scenario that you'd like to see.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. What about sort of along these same lines of obviously bias and ethics is sort of the theme where we keep coming back to. But here's a great question to Lisa on LinkedIn. Lisa says, what should organizations be doing to prepare their employees for using AI technology? For example, academia has strong positions about the use of AI with students. How should this be positioned in an organizational environment? So that's a great question. Are you seeing organizations put the proper sort of guardrails or parameters in place for how they view AI and how it should or shouldn't be used in their organizations?
Yeah, I'd love to see every organization that's leveraging artificial intelligence have some page on their website that talks about their principles and their values. In terms of preparing employees for using AI technology, one thing that I think organizations are going to need is to build trust with employees, especially if employees are in roles where they feel like the use of artificial intelligence could eventually replace their job. That is a risk for people. And it's not just a risk for people in certain industries. It is a risk broadly across the board, I think, for individuals, for people who are working in technology companies and for people who are working in fast food restaurants. AI is finding its way into every industry. So I think building trust is going to be really important. I think being transparent about the uses of artificial intelligence, if you're bringing AI into your organization and the hope is that it can reduce the workforce, then you need to be transparent about that off the top. And I know that organizations don't want to do that because they don't want to spook people, but it's definitely better to be transparent with people and let them know so that they can start dusting off their resume, so that they can start reaching out and maybe moving to different organizations if your plan is to reduce your workforce by bringing in artificial intelligence. I think that that's something that organizations can do. I think also talking to people about the use of AI in their day-to-day job and where it is okay to use AI and where it may not be okay to use AI. In my job at GitHub, I do not use ChatGPT to help me craft my messaging and positioning documentation for a specific feature or product. And part of that is because I don't want to hand over information that is private to GitHub and just put it out there willy-nilly on ChatGPT. I don't want to do that. And so if they're going to be using artificial intelligence, making sure that that the tools that they're using are authorized and that they know that those tools are authorized and that they understand sort of the red, yellow, green of when they can and can't and should and shouldn't use the AI.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think it would be good if every organization had those policies outlined for sure. And this is from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, how can we ensure that AI development is inclusive and promotes fairness across diverse populations?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Ensure is a really strong word. It's a high bar, and it's a word I want to use. But almost 10 years in the world of responsible AI tells me that ensure is a really high bar. But I do think that we can be intentional about AI development, and I do think that we can be considering how to make sure that it is inclusive, and continue to iterate on that. I think part of the reason that the idea of responsible AI or fair AI or inclusive AI scares some companies is because they think we have to get it right out of the gate. When I think that a lot more organizations who are building and using AI could come out of the gate and say, hey, we're starting here, but we're continually, this is where responsible AI comes in and governance processes, but we are continually evaluating the use and of this technology or how we're building this technology so that we can make it more inclusive, so that we can promote more fairness. And I also think when we talk about sort of fairness across diverse populations, I think that every organization could afford to invest more in this in particular, making sure that whatever they build or whatever they're using or deploying out into the world is promoting that fairness, and that it is a journey.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Sort of along these same lines, then, we talk about promoting fairness. We've talked about how organizations can set up their own parameters and sort of guidelines for how AI is used ethically and valuably within an organization. But what about when we look at governments in general, sort of looking throughout the world, and we talk about regulation, government regulation, which is still very, very early and immature, I would say, in terms of, governments haven't really caught up, I don't think, to really fully understanding how they should or could or want to regulate AI. Do you think that they're moving fast enough? What do you think will happen with government regulations as it relates to AI and ethics in the future?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. And this was a big thinker for me when I saw this question was on the docket. So are governments moving fast enough? I hesitate to answer that question because I think there are a lot of people across the spectrum who would say, for example, tech companies would say, you can slow it down. They'd probably say you can slow it down by a good 5 years, 10 years, and we'd be thrilled with that. But then there are people who are, yeah. And there's people on the research side who would say, we need regulation right now. People are experiencing harm because of this technology. So I think that different people will have varying opinions. My opinion is this, that I think that the EU AI Act is something that we should be paying attention to and understand, because I think it can tell us a lot about how it's best to govern the use of artificial intelligence. The EU has a one market system, so every artificial intelligence tool has to be shared before it can go to market in the EU. It has to go through this one funnel so that it's all, and it has to go through certain testing and standards and things of that nature. It has to go through a risk assessment based on the type of technology it is and what uses it has. So I think we can learn a lot from that. In the United States, I am nervous about the conversations that have been had so far about regulation, because a lot of it has just been promises. It's been, the AI Bill of Rights, and it's been I can't remember the name of the document right now, but all the tech companies have signed basically this commitment for AI safety in the United States. And that's good. It's nice, but it's not binding. And so it doesn't mean that if they say that they're going to do X, Y, and Z to make sure that their system is safe, doesn't mean that they have to do that. And then who's even checking that? They're self-reporting. So I do think that we could afford to move a little more quickly on regulation in the United States so that we have a level of protection. But I did want to mention this, that broad policy in the US is not the only option. Microsoft actually put out a set of recommendations to Congress. This is public. You can take a look at it. But they put out their recommendations, and they said that there were 3 things. I'm reading this off my notes here. 3 things that they feel would have an outsized impact on protecting the public from abusive generative AI uses. And one was enacting a federal deepfake fraud statute, which requiring AI system providers to use state-of-the-art provenance tooling to label synthetic data. So that would put the onus on the actual AI provider to have some kind of either visible or digital watermark so that when something is synthetically created. And then they also said ensuring that federal and state laws on child sexual exploitation and abuse and non-consensual intimate imagery are updated to include AI-generated content so that those penalties for creation and distribution of that information there would be penalties for those things, when right now there are not federally penalties for those things. So I think that there are ways that the US can move faster and have a meaningful impact, as Microsoft has outlined, without having massive policy right now.
Right. Yeah. What about as it relates to displacement or potential displacement of workers and people's income? If you think about AI in the 10, 20 years from now, and it could, displace as many as, I don't know if, I think Elon Musk sort of cited a study. I can't remember who the study is from, but I think it was hundreds of millions of jobs globally that could be potentially displaced as a result of AI in the long term. That's a big ethical question too. So you've got this new technology. It could eliminate jobs in some cases, kind of coming back to this government regulation piece of it, as well as just the general ethics of it all. How do you make sense of that? Or what are your thoughts or opinions on that whole piece of it, that whole potential conflict?
Yeah, I think that a requirement of, because this could have not just like massive effects on individuals who are laid off as a result of, or who can't find work because artificial intelligence is being used more. I think that this also could have just a massive downstream effect on the economy in general, and the US economy, the global economy. So certainly this is something that needs to be discussed and talked about. I think that having a requirement that organizations provide a level of training for individuals who, first of all, individuals in your organization, right? AI literacy training. How do you use AI? How can you leverage it in your job? And making sure that people have those types of things on their resume. But also, if you have a group of individuals who are laid off as a result of use of artificial intelligence in the organization, maybe their job has been replaced, providing some level of training for them, and not just training, not AI training necessarily, but just job skill training for those individuals. I think it's hard for me personally, having not done a ton of in-depth research on this, to predict what this is going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years. But I do think it's something that we definitely need to be concerned about. And a book that I'm reading right now that addresses this is called Rise of the Robots. So if anybody is interested in that, it is, research-based book that talks about the many uses of artificial intelligence and the ways that it's impacting, everyday people with everyday jobs.
Right. It's a cool book title too. Rise of the Robots. It's very draconian. What about the role of AI developers and engineers in promoting some of these ethical practices that we're talking about? So, in other words, how can they be trained to think about ethics from the start, as they're developing and deploying and rolling out and introducing these AI tools?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, the developers and engineers are the first line of defense. They may not have been in the room when the idea was created, but when something gets handed down to them, they're directly in a position to be able to understand. It's a unique position, and I think a very special position, to be able to understand how these AI systems were built and actually be part of building these AI systems. There are not a lot of people in the world who can say that they helped build some of these models that are used so broadly now. And so I think that they have a unique role in responsible AI, which is, for me, I think part of why we need buy-in. If you're in an organization that is building products, AI products, and putting them out into the world, having buy-in from your head of product that responsible AI is critical will be really important in making sure that your developers and your engineers are considering responsible AI. That also helps because if you do end up having a responsible AI system in place and governance processes or a safety board in place, when your products go to that safety board, then it's less likely, if the engineers and the developers are considering responsible AI at the front, it's less likely that it's going to have to go back and be rebuilt or updated or tweaked because it didn't meet the bar for the safety board. But I think that, developers and engineers are uniquely positioned to move the cause of responsible AI and inclusivity and fairness and transparency forward in a way that, other people are maybe not,
Yeah, absolutely. Now, here's a question from William on YouTube. William says, for most companies, AI will express itself as a feature in their tech stack. There won't be resources for a specific initiative. At what revenue level or industry do you see specific initiatives?
I'm assuming that William is asking about specific initiatives for responsible AI. So if it's just a feature in your tech stack, and William, if I'm incorrect about that, please let me know. But if you are seeing AI as just a feature in your tech stack, then maybe your responsible AI systems and processes don't need to be as robust. But my guess is that if an organization is bringing artificial intelligence in one way, that is probably just the beginning. So there's always the chance that that's going to grow and become bigger down the road, that you'll have artificial intelligence present itself in a more meaningful way. And I'll also say this, that a feature in a tech stack, that doesn't mean that just because it's a feature in a tech stack that it can't bring about its own type of risk. So and a significant risk possibly. So I don't think that there is a revenue threshold for if you bring in X amount of revenue, then you bring in a responsible AI system. I think that the threshold is, are you using artificial intelligence in your organization? Are you building it? Are you deploying it? Or are you using it? And if you are, then you need to find a right-sized responsible AI system process that helps you to be able to understand what the risks are. And if at the end of the day, your responsible AI team says, this is a feature in our tech stack, we've done our risk assessments on this, we understand, maybe it's a short period of time that they do that research and they're able to come out on the other side with a full understanding of what the risks are and how to mitigate those risks, then that's awesome. But it'll prepare you for the future if you have that system already in place.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. What in general, like with your role now at GitHub and just some of the work you do in your side business, how would you summarize where you think AI and ethics is headed? Like, what are you excited about, or how would you describe the future of AI and ethics? What do you think that'll look like if I'd ask you to predict the future, which I know is very difficult? Well,
the future of AI, I am hoping for artificial intelligence that can help. How do I say this? How do I say this on a podcast that focuses on people who are in business? Because business is important and using AI in business is important. But I would love help with things like doing my laundry, like stuff that can really provide me more free time. And so I would love to see AI kind of go that direction so that we can have access to it and help lighten the load for us in our personal lives as well. But in terms of AI in business, I think that we're going to see I think we're just going to keep going, right? 10 years from now, I think that we will see artificial intelligence embedded in businesses really significantly. I think we're going to see some more interesting uses of artificial intelligence. And I do think that we're going to see kind of a group of people who are maybe early adopters of AI and really figuring out how to get it into their work cycle and into their work style early. We're going to see those individuals be able to use artificial intelligence for productivity in a way that is like far and beyond what others who sort of didn't take it very seriously are seeing. So I think that that's what we might see. In terms of responsible AI, what I hope for is that organizations who are using or deploying or building artificial intelligence take responsible AI very seriously and find, like we said, that right-sized system for monitoring their uses of artificial intelligence and assessing the risk there and mitigating those risks. What I think we will probably see is that in the next 10 years, there will be some kind of massive responsible AI related issue. Something is going to happen where significant harm is going to occur, and then organizations are going to be compelled to put these responsible AI systems and processes in place. And I do think that it'll be a combination of risk, not too dissimilar to what we see with, like security risks. There weren't always security standards for people to meet, for organizations to meet. And then, a lot of really serious security breaches occurred. And then all of a sudden there were standards and policies and it was considered an investment to invest in security. So I think we're going to see a very similar storyline with responsible AI.
Yeah. Very interesting. What about when you think about ethical consideration or ethical concerns in AI's future? What do you think the biggest challenges would be? I know we've touched on a lot of concerns and challenges, but what do you think the biggest ones are going to be, either that we've already talked about or we haven't talked about yet, when we look to AI's future?
Yeah, I think definitely the challenges with jobs and employment. I think that is significant. I'll also say that just the uses of generative AI. There are people out there who are getting very, very good at prompting, and the results that come back to them are also very sophisticated and convincing. So I think that there are some significant challenges there. I think also with abusive generative AI content of a sexual nature, I think that we're going to see some really big challenges there, and I'm worried about that for a number of reasons. But one of them is, if there's some level of blackmail there, because you don't actually need to have explicit material of a person in order to now create explicit material of a person and put that out on the internet. And we're seeing some of that right now, that people who want to have an element of control, usually over women, will kind of lean into those resources that they have available to them in order to tarnish a person's reputation, or threaten them to a point where that person doesn't feel like they have any way out of that situation. So I think that these are things that we need to be taking a look at. I'll also say that I'm really worried about how AI is impacting the digital divide. It used to be that the digital divide was the people who were digitally excluded, we say, were without access to things like internet and devices. A lot of people now have access to internet and devices, but now the digital divide has changed so that having access to those things isn't the thing that makes you digitally included. It's being able to use those things to actually participate in the digital economy, to actually be able to experience upward social mobility because you were able to leverage what was available to you on the internet with your devices. And then artificial intelligence also has an impact on that, because as we talked about with jobs, the people who have access to the AI and who understand the possibility for it to move them forward significantly, they know how to leverage it in a way that lightens their workload. Those individuals are going to find themselves farther ahead than the individuals who are still struggling to understand how the internet can benefit them in general. And typically the people who are digitally excluded are people from lower income communities. So those are some of the things that I'm worried about.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Those are big concerns. And how do you think, when we look to society, business, and governments all together, how do we address those concerns? I mean, do you have answers to that, or do you have a vision of how you think it might unfold?
Yeah. Do we have answers to that? I remember reading through that this morning and kind of thinking through. I think that it's going to take a combination, right? I think that people are going to have to rise up and say there is a level of inequity here and we're not okay with it. I think that organizations are going to have to think beyond the possibility for profit and not just have programs that benefit people just for show, but programs that actually have meaningful impact on people who are trying to grow in their digital literacy or grow in their skill set. And I think that may mean that an organization needs to reach beyond putting something on a web page and actually engage with people on a local level, or even nationally, right, with the federal government, and provide these resources to groups who might not come across them in their everyday life. I think most Americans, for example, are not going to Microsoft.com or Google.com while they're going to Google to search. But you know what I mean? Like Google's business website to look for resources that may help them sharpen those skills. And so I think that kind of getting in the door where people may not know about those resources and making sure that they know that those are free to them. And then I think the government, one of the things that I've thought about a lot lately is in 1946, the National School Lunch Program, or National School Lunch Act, was signed. And I think about that often because I don't think we're in a dissimilar situation right now with where we're at with artificial intelligence. And the National School Lunch Act was signed so that individuals could students could have access to school or to lunch every day at school. And that has had a significant impact in the decades, after that was signed. I think that we need something similar policy-wise to ensure that in the places where there are maybe some of these vulnerable populations, this access to this technology is there.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting. And it is interesting to compare it to something like school lunch, and and we take some of that stuff for granted now, decades later, but we're sort of in the thick of how we're going to deal with AI. And And I think that makes for a super interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Very cool. So what else, and anything else you're excited about just in the AI space in general, whether it's ethics related or not? I know you're at the forefront of a lot of different things, not just the ethics of it, but anything else that you're excited about that we haven't talked about, just out of curiosity?
In terms of uses of AI, you know what I am interested in, or this is, so we do have a Tesla. It's my husband's car. He purchased it before we were married, and now we are a one car family. So we have this car, and I never let him drive it on like self-driving mode when I'm in the car. It's like a hard no for me.
Right.
But in San Francisco, they have the Waymo, and I have taken the Waymo twice now, which is just a fully like driverless car. There's not even a person sitting in the front seat to make sure nothing goes wrong. You're just you in the back seat, and you're being driven by just the car. So it was very interesting, and I am curious to see, where that goes and where we're going to be 10 years from now with those kinds of uses of AI. I am interested to see where we're going with like humanoid robots, and that's a big one that everybody's talking about right now. And for me personally, I can't make up in my mind the distance between where we are and where we want to be with humanoid robots, and primarily because one of the things that humanoid robots struggle with the most is something that's usually very easily for humans is dexterity, and it's very challenging to get a robot to have that level of dexterity and be more agile like a human. But I think with Boston Dynamics and other developers that we're beginning to see some movement in that area, which is really interesting. These are definitely some of the areas that I'm like a little bit interested in, but I'd be curious to hear also if you have anything that you're particularly interested in seeing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to summarize what you just said, it sounds like if I summarize what you're most excited about or what you're thinking about, it sounds like you trust self-driving cars and robots more than you trust your husband's driving. That's what I took away from the conversation.
You know what it is? It's the risk. It's that if our car crashes on like self-driving mode, then I'm like, we don't have a car because we're a one car.
Oh, gotcha.
Family. If this in the streets of San Francisco, I still go to work, so
right. That's
like,
true. You have other options.
Yeah. So yeah.
That's funny. No, I think to your question though about what I'm excited about, I'm curious to hear what the audience is excited about too. If you have any thoughts on what you're excited about with AI or which questions you still have, I'd love to hear those in the chat here. But I think for me, it's the generative AI side of things in terms of just seeing how organizations use just some fundamental, just core basic generative AI type stuff because there's so much it can do. And I think organizations struggle with the opportunities or the possibilities. They don't know where to start. And so I'm curious to see just more fundamentally, like how do organizations start to leverage generative AI and how do they start to put parameters in place like you talked about earlier? That's super interesting to me too, because so many companies are just trying to figure out, what the hell this is, what can it do? And then, I think you're thinking way ahead of where most organizations are. Most organizations are just trying to figure out what it means to us, how we're going to use it, how it's going to add value to our organization, how we're going to protect ourselves from the potential downside risk. All those questions are still out there. So I'm just curious to see, those basic questions answered here in the next few years.
Yeah, me too. And you know what I'm really excited about is seeing an organization that takes on with some level of vigor the challenge of responsible AI and implementing those systems, that they don't just do it because they happen to have AI and they think this is the right thing to do and it protects their investment and legal and policy and blah, 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 but that they say, no, we truly believe that we can build and deploy artificial intelligence and we can do it responsibly, and we're going to take that challenge on. And I'm interested to see how that evolves, because right now, a lot of the examples we have, there's like 100 frameworks out there, maybe more, that different government organizations and nonprofits and different industries, et cetera, have built. But a lot of the large companies that are doing this are like the Microsofts and the Googles and even Amazon has some level of responsible AI that they're employing. But I'd like to see a new player come in and not just do the basics to say that they're doing it, but really take it on with vigor.
Yeah, it's very cool. Yeah. Well, so do you have any sources? I know you mentioned the book, Rise of Robots. Do you have any other publications, articles, books, or resources in general that you'd recommend to the audience that wants to learn more about this stuff?
Yeah, I think if you're interested in policy and keeping up with that, the Center for AI and Digital Policy, CAIDP, is very good. So I would, and that's global. So you'll get kind of a global perspective on that. A book that helped broaden my perspective on how I could have a meaningful impact on AI was called AI Needs You. And I think the author is Verity Harding. If you're interested in something, in understanding how some of this in-depth research is conducted on certain systems, Dr. Joy Buolamwini's book, Unmasking AI, is very good. And it walks through her whole experience with how she even got into the world of facial recognition technology. And she did some of the, initial research on bias in AI systems. And it is her research that ultimately found that these large facial recognition systems from these large companies were able to see, white men more often than they were able to see, significantly more often than even being able to recognize Black women. And so just really interesting research that she did, and she walks through how she conducted that research. So those are some of the resources that I would probably point folks to. Yeah.
And those that are not connected to you, what's the best way to connect with and follow you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is a great one, and then I'm also on TikTok. I haven't been on in a couple of weeks because I've just been. You have to take a break from time to time on TikTok. It's a wild world out there. So, but I haven't. But I am, I have some videos in progress right now that I hope to post here shortly, and that's where I do sort of my shorter form content just to kind of keep people updated. But people can definitely connect with me on LinkedIn, and from time to time I get asked about speaking engagements, and you can always email me. My information is on my LinkedIn. So
perfect. And just so everyone knows, your name is spelled Paige, Paige Lord, Lord.
Yep.
So if you search that on LinkedIn, you'll be able to find her there. And I think I first found you on TikTok. That's actually where I first came across some of your content. And then I saw an interview you did with Emma Roloff, and it sort of led me to ask you on this podcast. So thank you for being here today. Really appreciate your time today, Paige.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you to the audience for the great questions here. We'll share this episode, or we'll share this interview as part of a upcoming Transformation Ground Control podcast episode that gets released 2 to 3 weeks from now. Every Wednesday we drop new episodes, so be sure to check that out at transformationgroundcontrol.com. We do these live podcast interviews every Tuesday as part of that production. So same time, same place every week. We talk about digital transformation. So hope to see you here next week or in coming weeks at the same time. And hope you have a great week in the meantime. And